Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and tonight I'm joined, first of all, by Matt Oldroyd.
Hi, Rory. You okay?
I'm good, mate. Thank you very much for coming on. And I'm also joined by Dave Marples. Dave, how are you doing?
Good, good, thank you. Good evening to you, and thanks for having us on.
Not at all. Thank you both very much for coming on. Dave and Matt, as all of our listeners will find out, have an absolute wealth of experience and knowledge in talking about all things Nottingham Forest. And that's exactly who we're going to be talking about today. The club's history, the club's identity, and the various publications that the two have been involved in. It's going to be an episode all about Forest, and I'm really, really excited for it. Probably couldn't have picked a better season to be talking about them as well. And at the time of recording, which is just at the beginning of February, things are looking pretty positive for the club to end up back in the Champions League, which in terms of Forest history and heritage is absolutely massive for the club. So it's a great time to be recording this episode. I'm really looking forward to it. We're going to be diving into one of England's most historic and I'd say probably most important clubs as well. A lot of people might not see them like that. We're going to talk about the different perceptions that people have of Forest throughout the episode, but I just want to put that in first of all. One of the things we are going to be touching on is how this football club pioneered and championed a lot of the things that we either take for granted or might not realise have happened within football since. Before we get stuck into things properly, as per, Matt, if you could just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself first of all.
Yeah, hi. I think probably within the Forest fan base, I'm probably best known for my role in the fan group Forza Garibaldi. So we do a lot of the banners and big displays around the stadium. We've been doing that now for best part of, I think, 8 years, maybe 9 years. So I've been doing that. And through that, I've sort of developed a bit of a passion for the club's history and culture and heritage, I guess. So I sat around doing various historical elements that we'd bring into our flags and displays and other visuals, and started trying to find other ways and means to tell that story about Forest's history. So a few years ago, I set up another sister account called the Forest Preservation Society, which you'll find on all the various social media channels, as with the Forza Garibaldi one. Started doing my own little passion project to that, and then at the time started doing a few little bits more about writing around Forest. I've done bits in the Matchday programme and various other articles. And then, sat around sort of writing and doing more on that side of things, really.
That's brilliant. In fact, the Forza Garibaldi stuff is something that I'm going to touch on pretty heavily. I think it's really important that as someone who is involved in fan organisation, someone who involves all the fan displays, tifos, etc., it's important that the club uses and kind of taps into its heritage and puts that across in its displays. Dave, it's your turn. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about you?
Yeah, pleasure. It's like Matt. Well, I describe myself as basically Forest General busybody. I started writing and blogging about Forest, I'd say about 10 years ago or so, and that led to various things, editing a couple of fanzines, which were lucky enough to make the shortlist for the FSA Awards, so that was really, really nice. Along the way, I've written a couple of books as well, one about 30 historic or iconic Forest goals in the history of the club, and another one about detailing the whole rivalry between Forest and Derby since conception up to present day as well. I've also had a column in the Forest programme for 7 seasons or so as well. So, generally interfering, watching, writing from afar and keeping busy doing those things.
Perfect. Certainly does keep both of you busy, trying to balance a lot of plates at once there. But I guess we'll probably just kick things off right from the start. But there's one thing that I wanted to ask you first of all. I mean, what is it that really kind of kick-started your interest with Nottingham Forest history? Obviously, Matt, you mentioned doing it through the tifos, but was there a piece of information that you found or a story that you heard that then kind of went and spurred that interest on?
It's a good question, and I'm probably not sure if I've got a definitive answer. I know that part around the tifos in 2019 we did one. We had an idea actually from a fellow fan about Forest's rebellious past, but specifically Nottingham as a city's rebellious history. So we did a display around the rebel city, and it featured icons of not necessarily football, although Clough was in it. People from across Nottinghamshire or from Nottinghamshire, and there was writers in there. There was the Luddite movement that some may be familiar with, which was about workers' rights in the I think it was the 19th century. And all sorts of other characters. And we did something around that. And what we were finding was that we put something out that was new and, dare I say, a little bit educational. And then afterwards, we could tell the story a little bit more about it. So we always keep these things under wraps. But afterwards, we could say, right, well, this was the inspiration, and this is this character, and this is this character. So that probably, I'm thinking back a little bit further if there was anything else, but certainly in terms of recent history and me taking a bit more of a proper interest in it, I think it might have been that Rebel City one where, yeah, we were able to tell a story that has a little bit become embedded in the club in terms of this rebellious nature that we have as along with the city.
I actually really like that, the idea of Nottingham as a rebel city, just through the characters and the history that's come through. It is really interesting how that kind of aligns with the club in many ways. And in many ways, how the club has kind of adopted that identity and its style of play and the way that it operates and stuff like that is really, really fascinating. So, I mean, I'm guessing then for both of you, being involved in that history, writing books and being involved in fanzines and telling those stories to other people was a natural next step.
Yeah, it's a bit like, I don't know about you, Mike, it's a bit like a scab. And once you start sort of scratching it, it sort of gets a bit more addictive and you start peeling a bit more away kind of thing. Because we all know, even civilian non-Forest fans know about, the European Cups, etc. But then you start sort of thinking about, well, what were we like in the 60s? What were we like before then? And what about before the FA Cup? Was that a good team in 59 or was it just an average team? Did we get lucky? So you start scratching away. And then the more kind of you pursue that, the more interesting little stories you find, and then you're constantly stuck in a cycle of trying to piece it all together and come up with some kind of timeline, I guess, of the club's history, which I wouldn't say we've nailed it between us, Matt, at all, but together we've kind of like really widened our understanding of this club and what it means from conception up to now.
Yeah, I would say you've certainly chipped away at a fair part of it as well, but it's not just been copy and paste like Wikipedia histories. You've actually added some substance into explaining what all these things are, explaining what heritage is, in other words, explaining what an identity is and what Nottingham Forest identity is as well, to people who might not otherwise be able to explain it. So that's quite important within itself as well. And I suppose you'll both know, and we'll get on to talk about this a bit more later on, that in this post-1992 world where everything revolves around what happened afterwards, it's important to keep these stories alive and preserve them, because as far as other people were concerned, pre-1992, Nottingham Forest may as well not have existed.
Yeah, I mean, we had that spell that everybody knows about in terms of the Brian Clough era. So European Cups, Munich and Madrid, Wembley visits. I think fans of that generation will tell you that we were going every year for what seemed like several years. 92 was a bit of a strange one in that we fell away pretty quickly. Cloughy went, we dropped out of the division, had a very brief renaissance under Frank Clark, and then have been pretty awful ever since. So I think what you touched on at the very top of the show, Rory, about sort of Forest, what we're doing now, it's been brilliant in that we've actually come out of an absolute abyss, and it really has been a real dark place at times. 92 is obviously that threshold and that benchmark because of what happened with the Premier League and stuff like that. But for Forest fans in particular, it was a very much a sliding doors moment, with the Clough era coming to a shuddering and sad end, and then with what happened afterwards. So I think Dave would probably concur, we have a history that people know about in terms of pre-92, in terms of 79 and 80 with European Cups. But I think there's probably a much wider and deeper history there, and a lot of really fascinating stuff that benchmarks that. And I think the really brilliant thing is now we are benchmarking some fantastic stuff from decades prior to the European Cups with a new history, which is forming now, probably post-Wembley 2022.
Just to touch a bit more, Matt, on that 92, which, as you said, Rory, a key moment in English football. There's a lot to be unpicked about that, so I'll try and keep it brief. But obviously, the first season of the Premier League, we managed to get ourselves relegated bottom, which was also Brian Clough's final season. So there's a real sense of an era coming to an end. We got back after one season under Frank Clark, and we had a brilliant 2 years, finished third under Clark, then we went to Europe, got to quarterfinals of the FA Cup and the UEFA Cup at the same time. So we kind of felt like, oh, well, the Premier League, this is it. We're here to stay. And then through various reasons, mismanagement, selling players, not replacing players, and just, dropping out again. Since then, we were, as you said, Matt, in a total abyss. So what's really interesting there is that the Premier League was the Premier League, but the real big money didn't start flowing in until the late 90s and early 2000s. And obviously, if you weren't around at that stage, you just missed out. And by our typical timing, we just utterly missed out on that one, which meant that we were just this very mediocre, very bang average championship club for so long. So our timing wasn't great in that period at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say as an outsider looking in, probably part of the reason that a lot of people see Forest as being the old guard is probably that relegation in the first season, or the first year, sorry, of the Premier League. And it was almost kind of like a changing of the guard, and that obviously coincided with the Clough era coming to an end, and then everything that kind of followed, the absolute, shitstorm basically of what came next.
I think interesting. Up until we got promoted recently, I'm just trying to count off the top of my head. I'm sure you'll correct me, Matt. I think we've only spent 4, maybe 5 seasons in the Premier League in total. So 3 under Clark, and then down, and then up for 1, then down, then up for 1, and then that was it for 20 years, basically. So I know what you're saying, Rory, about this kind of mainstay because we were there. But in total, we've not really spent a lot of time in the Premier League, and I guess for 3 of those 5 seasons, we've stunk the place out and finished bottom. Up until the recent promotion, anyway, obviously.
Yeah, recently has been a bit better, and we'll obviously come on to touch on that. But before we jump on to 1992, let's go back to the very beginning, origins of Nottingham Forest, and where a lot of the club colours and identities, and where the club culture was really born.
So we were quite close to the birth of the what we might call the modern game in terms of post association rules and post sort of Sheffield FC and obviously there was Notts County as they are now across the river, not at the time, but very close to us in Nottingham. So we came about in 1865, and a group of 15 men met at the Clinton Arms in Nottingham, an old pub which is still actually there today, albeit under a different name. And these 15 men were playing a form of hockey called shinty, and decided that they'd probably want to follow in the footsteps of the likes of Notts County and Sheffield FC and others that were coming to the fore at the time, and switch to football. I have different theories about when the club truly came into existence, but I think likelihood is it was probably late on in 1865. But it was 1866 truly when we started to mobilise ourselves in terms of organising training sessions, playing our first matches, which actually was against Notts. And we were, as we call ourselves, the original Reds. So we chose the colours of an Italian revolutionary many might be familiar with called Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had done sort of all sorts of tremendous things in his home country of Italy in terms of unifying the country and bringing sort of peace there after years of civil war. And I'm sure there are people listening who know more about that side of history than I do, but whatever the reason, the 15 guys that set up Forest were inspired by Garibaldi and wanted to pay homage to him. So his red-shirted armies, which had fought with him in South America and in Italy, were the calling card for our club. So we sent one of the new founders down, and he ordered a set of Garibaldi red tasselled hats, which was our original uniform, and we set up camp on the Forest Recreation Ground, which is a wide expanse just north of what is now the city centre. And we had a fairly humble beginning, I think. There are talk about how Forest were potentially one of the clubs that kind of started to open the game up a little bit more to the working classes. And we were a little bit more open to playing games against local sides from Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Yorkshire as well. Hopefully we were one of the ones that started to try and erode that slightly elitist side to the game and make it more of what we probably think of now as a working class sport. So we were quite instrumental from the early days, and we were plodding along quite nicely, and really started in the 1870s. I would say we started to become a bigger club when we started to go into the FA Cup, as many others did, and we started to revolutionise the game with some of the things that we were doing and inspiring. And from fairly modest and simple beginnings, we quickly became quite an important football club.
Matt, you mentioned sort of, because we weren't founder members of the First League. I read somewhere, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, was that because something about how we could have pushed a little bit more to be involved in that First League, but part of it was that we wanted to remain resolutely amateur or local to Nottingham. Is that right, or am I sort of getting a bit exaggerating there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the league came a little bit later, didn't it? So 1888, if I'm not mistaken, was the start of the Football League, and Forest were part of that discussion. Again, I don't place myself as someone who knows this absolutely, but my two theories are very simple. That at the time, Notts County were arguably the bigger of the clubs, and the Football League, probably understandably, didn't want to put too much focus on one area. So we were basically put aside because they chose Notts County, because they didn't want two Nottingham clubs. And then, I think you're right, Dave. Football clubs had started to turn professional around this time. From the mid-1880s, really. And we resisted. We were the last of the so-called major clubs at the time. who just wouldn't have it. And we were fiercely against turning into a professional football club. And I think my other theory is that counted against us as well. I think the Football League had grand ideas, very good ideas, and I think they wanted sort of forward, progressive football clubs. And Forest, because of their amateur leanings, were not seen as that, even if that was probably a little bit unfair.
So up till sort of like turns, as you said, Matt, we were very mediocre. Apart from FA Cup, now obviously there weren't many rounds in the FA Cup at that stage, and you had a whole hodgepodge of teams playing in the FA Cup, contesting the FA Cup. We had a bit of success in some semi-finals, and then we won it in 1898 as well against Derby. But I guess from then on, not a lot happened for a large part of our early history, mediocre, mid-table for that huge period, really.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to come on to say, is that obviously Forest had this kind of really, I don't know what the word is, but again, it's one of those things that you can't really explain, because it kind of plays into what the club's culture would become of this kind of, rebellious club. It had this really sort of bohemian start to life. In some ways, I think that's probably the best term, or the closest thing we're going to get to it. But after that, and after things sort of stabilised, things really went in peaks and troughs for Forest. Sometimes to the extreme, but most of the time, as you said, Dave, it was just kind of middling in many ways, wasn't it, for a very long time?
Yeah, I think before we get to late 50s, obviously we could talk about Billy Walker, Matt, definitely, and his contribution from the 40s and the 50s as well. But yeah, as you said, that's pretty much what we were till 59 FA Cup. Nothing majorly achieved at all. Although we did have a few instances where we nearly managed to go out of business due to funding issues and financial issues, which may or may not be a result of our resolute status and lack of professionalism. That's a bit unfair, but the way we wanted to keep this, to use your words, Rory, bohemian outlook as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think just by nature of the way that the club was and other types of things that happened throughout those decades, yeah, it just kind of played into it. But at the end of the day, it all kind of led to the club really sort of stabilising itself and becoming a bit of a mainstay within the league, which is just as important as, either finishing at the very top or finishing at the very bottom, because for a very long time, Forest were part of the bread and butter of the league. And I would argue they probably still are in terms of English football today, as we said earlier on, one of the old guard.
Yeah, definitely. Forest, I think, are known and respected as being a fairly sizable club. We never claimed to be one of the biggest. That would be wrong. Even when we were winning stratospheric achievements and stuff like that, we were never the biggest club around, far from it. But we've been steady. I think at times we've been pretty erratic, I think it's fair to say. But for a lot of the time, we've been a steady first division, and I mean that in the old term, or second division football club, who generally have had periods of exceptionalism, like Dave says, the period in the 1950s where we got back to we first got to Wembley, should I say, and we won the FA Cup, followed obviously then by a fantastic team under Johnny Carey in the late 60s with people like Ian Storey-Moore, Joe Baker, and that ilk, who sadly came second in the old Division 1 and couldn't quite topple Manchester United. But we have these moments, and I think going back to what we were saying, we were a little bit far-reaching in that we would have this moment where we would do something extraordinary, but because of the size of our club and actually going back to the amateur status, we were the last of the clubs to ever move over to like what was the limited liability side of things. In terms of, we stayed the old clubhouse, we kept that mentality even after we'd taken on professional footballers. You talked about used bohemian, which I think is quite a good term, Rory. One of the terms I heard to describe Forest was artisan. And that was our background. We had a different outlook. I'm not saying we were chilled out and relaxed, but we just went with the flow. And I think that was a big criticism of Forest, sort of from turn of the century 1900 all the way through to the Clough era in a way. We were ran by a committee of 7 men who were just local businessmen, and they were relatively happy, got their feet under the table. We had bits of success and then we'd fall away again. Always kind of steady, as I say. We never really collapsed, other maybe the odd occasion, but we just ambled on. And I think that was the thing when we got into the 70s and when people started to really get frustrated that we'd gone down again, and we needed that injection, which of course takes us on to the Clough and Taylor area where everything changed, and that it upset the apple cart in terms of the old structure of the club, but it was the hurricane that Forest just needed.
Just got this image of bohemian and artisan of Forest being populated with players who smoke Gilloise cigarettes and discuss philosophy.
Yeah, I think artisan's a really good way of putting it as well, actually. But I think kind of describing that period between founding and I mean, it is obviously we're not saying that there aren't stories from Nottingham Forest in between these times. There most certainly are, but for the most part, and for the purposes of this show, up until the Clough era, the club didn't have a huge amount to scream and shout about, I would argue.
I think, I mean, I will just say, Rory, it might be jumping slightly ahead, but I think with the project I've been on with in terms of the book, I think I'm trying to show that there was an undercurrent. Almost, I describe it as a bit of an alternative history. Appreciate we might come on to this a little bit later, but that aside, there was the '59 Cup final, which was fantastic. I think what I would probably point to in terms of a really fascinating part of the club was during both World Wars. We came so close at the start of both of them, 1939 in particular. Forest very nearly went under, and I don't think that story is potentially as well known as it might be. We were going to shut up shop. We were massively struggling to survive. And there was a talk about maybe just shutting the club down in 1939, this is, for the duration of the war, for however long that may last. But we had a chairman at the time, Harry Cobbin, and he made a decision that actually this was far too big for it to fall under his watch and to slide out of existence. So he actually went down to the bank, didn't tell anybody, and handed over a large chunk of his own personal finances to keep the club going. And I like the growth of how we used the Second World War Forest to actually having come very close to toppling over. We grew out of that. Billy Walker in particular, who was a fascinating and pivotal figure in our history, sort of almost redefined how youth structures and youth, I know they weren't called academies at the time, but it was almost the starting point, I think, for how that came decades later. And Billy Walker was instrumental to not just how Forest thrived during the Second World War, but actually how football clubs started to champion youth and really bring it out. There's a nice story there. Billy Walker, by the time that we got into the 50s, he was the only manager surviving from sort of the pre-war era. And he was shown great patience. We went down to the third tier, bounced back up again. We had some fantastic players. Wally Ardron's one that very older Forest fans will remember in terms of goal-scoring records that he set. And eventually that did lead us back to 1959 and Wembley's success against Luton. So I think there is an era there which is so fascinating. And in fact, actually, just quickly, Dave and I, along with a friend of ours, Danny, we did a quite serious and deep dive last year into Forest's history during the war and worked out that 1941 was the starting point of Forest having a youth player in their matchday squad without fail from October 1941 to the present day, and that record still stands now. We think impressive. It's the second, we're pretty sure it's the second longest behind Manchester United, who have one back to 1937. So it's that's been part of the joy as well of the history that we like, and we can go back and find these things. So that war period, to answer your question, I think was a really fascinating and pivotal point of the club's history, and how we, not that it wasn't followed by more trauma and more sort of despair, but it was a real starting point, I think, for the club to reinvent itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and I'm glad we've kind of touched on the cup final in 1959, because there's a great story about a Scottish player within that cup final team. I'm actually reading a book about him just now called Stuart Imlach. The book that I'm reading is by his son, Gary Imlach. Just an absolutely fascinating story. This kind of goes into another conversation that we can have about players from, well, Scotland in particular, who went and done incredible things during this period within England, but the stories are often forgotten about. I'm not sure what it is about that post-war period from about the kind of 50s to the mid-60s that just seems to go under the wire so much. But Stuart Imlach was an absolute pivotal figure within Forest team at that point in time as well. And obviously injuries eventually ended up hampering him, but playing, it was absolutely magnificent, and not anywhere near enough is actually told about him, in my opinion, anyway.
No, he was, for various reasons, Matt and I have watched independently that 59 Cup final, because that's the kind of thing we do. Imlach was superb. He was absolutely superb. He was quick as a whippet. And some of the football that was played, you had this idea bit of a surprise to me. I have this idea of being very slow, very pedestrian, but I was quite surprised. And we're not going to say it was great quality compared to what we watch these days, but it was football not from a different era or a different planet. It was very recognisably football, and you're absolutely right about him. Like he played a huge part for Forest. Didn't he go to the World Cup as well in '58?
He was the first Forest player ever to be selected by Scotland. And he did make 4 appearances for Scotland against Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia and France. The games against Yugoslavia and France took place at the 1950 World Cup final, so you're absolutely spot on, Dave. Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to what Forest had and the foundations of what were put in place there, as you said, Matt, by Billy Walker. To actually go and find these players from around England, to actually put these things in place. And it's something that's really influenced the club in the future as well. As you said, and as we'll come to touch on later, it's one of the first times that anything that we can see that resembles a youth academy being set up in the country as well. Then obviously we get into the era that everyone knows about, which is the Brian Clough era and the Taylor era as well. This is the peak of what it means to be a Forest fan, isn't it?
Yeah, we don't like to talk about it much as Forest fans. We never mention it.
No, just a little bit. We'll give them just a little bit, Dave. That underdog spirit again. Obviously, we've talked about it a little bit already. I think that defines Forest in that era. Nobody expected us to do it in the same way. Of course, yeah, Celtic to an extent, Villa a few years after we'd done it. It was an extraordinary time. I will say, just to be clear, it was before my time. I was a few years away at this point when we were conquering Europe, but it was remarkable because of where we came from. I think the nights in Munich and Madrid, 79 and 80, were standalone phenomenons. They really were, with what we did and that team of ragtag footballers. But I think the context of it that I really cherish most of all, and I think many Forest fans do, was when Brian Clough arrived in January 1975. It was actually 50 years ago in January this year, last month. He turned up and he had half of the European Cup winning team in his side, and we were 16th in the old Division 2, struggling, just plodding along. And the likes of John Robertson, Ian Bowyer, Martin O'Neill, Viv Anderson, Tony Woodcock, they were there. They weren't all necessarily senior first team players, but they were there. They were doing their thing. And I think it's incredible that Clough didn't have the greatest of starts, but he got us up somehow. We came third. Literally, there's a famous story how close it was about how we were on a plane to Mallorca, one of Clough's favourite hotspots to go away, and we were relying on a result. I think it involved Wolverhampton Wanderers. I can't
Bolton
quite remember
and Wolves, Matt.
Bolton and Wolves, and we were relying on a result that was never going to happen. And we went away thinking, well, we've had a good shot. We've got half a chance, I suppose, but we're not going to get it. That result will not go in our favour, and it did. And we snuck out of that league. I wouldn't say it was a fluke, clearly not, but we were very fortunate with how it transpired at the end. And a year later, we were lifting the Football League Championship. And those players, those Robertsons, O'Neills, they were integral to it. They'd been there as a meandering football team a few years earlier. It was extraordinary where we came from. Not just the fact that we went and had that success and that silverware, but it was where we were. And I will champion as much as I can about. I just don't think anybody else that has ever graced this sport could ever do it apart from Clough and Taylor. I just think it was such a unique, phenomenal achievement that they did, and to go there and win the league and then go there and win the European Cup and then defend it. I mean, there are always clearly other people that will point to other stories and how maybe more modern achievements might compare, but I just think that trio of that league followed by 2 European Cups in succession was just something that can never really be repeated, in my opinion.
I don't think anyone will ever do that again, in my opinion.
No, not at all. Just to echo a little bit what you said, Matt. The extraordinary thing is not just where we came from, but I remember just before my time as well. But I remember sort of started going in '82. I remember learning about or picking up a book and sort of seeing we were European champions, which I was vaguely aware of. But I genuinely remember the sort of surprise of discovering that we did it again the year after. That really kind of blew my tiny young mind, because to not just win the European Cup once, but to do it twice as well, that really was phenomenal.
I think within the story of Forest, it speaks to something a lot bigger as well, because, and again, this is probably, from my perspective, you always see those graphics do the rounds every single year, and it's like the year-by-year winners of the European Cup and you've always got Forest on there twice, once after the other. And to me, when I was young looking at that, I was like, oh, that must have meant that it wasn't just a fluke. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't just a one-off. This meant that they were actually able to defend it, and a lot better than at the time when I was growing up they were as well. And of course, sadly, after the Clough era, things really take a bit of a nosedive for a bit of a while. And, that's not to brush over any of other Clough's achievements, because what he'd done at Nottingham Forest was incredible. But sadly, since then, things haven't been all that great.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right, Rory. Just to pick up on that era post 1980, it was a really interesting era, the 80s for Forest, I think. And it looks like exactly what you said, that we didn't really achieve much, or we fell off a cliff or whatever. There's a few other things going on in the background there, I think. We spent a lot of money, obviously, at Trevor Francis, and at the same time, what we decided to do was build a brand new, huge stand, which was called at the time the Executive Stand and now the Brian Clough Stand. And that, it didn't nearly bankrupt us, but we were paying that off an awful lot. At the same time, Clough and Taylor hastily decided to sell all their best players, basically. So we were starting again from scratch. The weird thing is, then a lot of those players who we got rid of, they decided, Clough and Taylor, that actually we sold them a bit too early, we need them back, kind of thing. So we got Boyer back, we got various players back as well. Against that backdrop, what Clough did, especially from sort of 82, 83 onwards, he had a really young team, almost going back to Billy Walker's Colts, basically. But he had ridiculously young players coming inside, like Des Walker and Nigel Clough, who made their debuts in 85, 86. So there was very little money to spend. He had to sort of put his reliance and faith in youth. And against that background, I don't think we ever finished in the bottom half of the top league. And we also were this far away from reaching a UEFA Cup final in 1984, from which we were, I'm sure you know the stories, we're officially cheated out of that. We'll try not to get too angry about that now. We're going to let it go, maybe. So against that backdrop, we were still, throughout these sort of 80s, everybody's it comes back to what I was saying earlier about sort of representations and branding as well. We were still a lot of everybody's favourite team. It was Clough's young lads with sort of very short haircuts who didn't argue with the referee. So it was, I wouldn't say it's a miracle, obviously I'd stop short of that, but throughout the 80s, for Brian Clough, without Peter Taylor for a lot of the time as well, to rebuild this team and come up with a whole new team, which didn't win the title, which didn't get to European Cup finals, admittedly, but did regularly sort of compete in the top 4, top 5 of the First Division, and never really finished below sort of mid-table. I thought that was an underrated period of what Brian Clough achieved in that period.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's probably fair enough as well, because it's not as if you were just at the top for a very short period of time and then utterly collapsed. You sustained quite a healthy place at the top of the table thereafter as well, and were always there or thereabouts, and kind of became part of that fabric of the upper table as well, which, as you mentioned, is just as important.
Definitely, and it was a time, because that's when I was going. It's the time when we regularly went to Wembley from sort of 88 to 92, League Cup finals. You remember the Simod Cup final, the full Members Cup, or you might not. I don't know. The full Members Cup final. There was the 1989. I think it was the centenary of 1988 centenary of the Football League, and there was a patched up ramshackle competition held at Wembley to celebrate that, which we won as well on penalties, which against Sheffield Wednesday in front of a half-empty Wembley. So it was all we sort of maintained, as you said, Rory, that sort of status as part of the fabric of the First Division.
And I think this is where, I suppose, perception becomes quite important, because we are starting to enter that kind of transition era between Clough and the Premier League, where a lot of people look at the 80s and for all the bad and the negatives that were going on in the background, a lot of people actually look at the 80s as being quite positive in terms of the football that was going on the field. And this is getting into conversations about nostalgia, which is interesting in itself, because a lot of people will say, well, actually the football was shit, but then a lot of people look back on it quite fondly and say, oh, I miss it when it was the 80s and the football was better and all that kind of stuff. So nostalgia is wholly political, and that's something that we'll talk about on another episode at some point. You're really kind of getting into this time where Forest are starting to middle again, not so much start to fall down, but there's sort of this overarching sort of worry that things aren't quite what they seem and that things are about to go downhill.
Yeah, I think if I'm sure we've all seen it. The final interview Brian Clough gives when we get relegated, and he looks, bless him, like a man out of time. Around him, the landscape's changing. You've got Sky strikers doing cheerleading before the game. You've got the whole razzmatazz of Monday Night Football, and like I said, he just looks like this is not his era. It's time for double training. It's you couldn't necessarily get away with letting the players not train Monday to Friday and then just rocking up and trying to beat Manchester United. It just wasn't going to happen at all in that era. And I think by his own admission, we let the ball drop hugely. He did as well. If we'd have bought Stan Collymore the season we were relegated, which we were looking to do, maybe things might have been different, but probably not. So we persisted with Gary Bannister and Robert Rosario up front, which was probably never going to end in much success at all.
And I'm guessing then that this was really the era that you guys were really getting stuck into all things Forest, which is unfortunate because, as you both mentioned, you just had to read about the European Cup as opposed to experiencing it beforehand. So really it was this period that you guys would have seen and actually been going through all the games of, experiencing your formative years supporting Forest at this point. So, you must have some amount of stories from that time.
Yeah, I mean, for a while actually, I went around thinking I was to blame because my first game was in Clough's final season in relegation. Jumping ahead slightly, I will pop back in a minute, but jumping ahead slightly, my first season ticket was under David Platt in 1999 when we crashed out and never returned to the top flight for 23 years, I think it was. So yeah, I certainly coincided with a bit of a dodgy period, and although we did resurrect ourselves briefly, Frank Clark was fantastic, and I think there was a good helping of magic left from the Clough era in terms of some of them players that remained, Stuart Pearce being one, obviously, that got us straight back into the Premier League with these fantastic signings that we had, Lars Bohemian, Stan Collymore. And I remember, although I was still a relatively young lad, we were phenomenal in that 94-95 season under Clark when we got back up. We eventually finished third, but that probably doesn't tell the story of what we were doing. We went and won at Old Trafford, who were fairly untouchable on their home ground in those days, unlike now. We had all sorts of stuff that happened that season. 7-1 at Hillsborough stands out, obviously. But we were just a remarkable, brilliant, energetic football team. And I look back now and it was brilliant because of my age. And I was 9 or 10 and I was going to a few games, not as many as I'd have liked to have done, but I was going to a few games and I was following it on the telly and on Match of the Day. And I have brilliant memories of that time because of how awesome we were. And I looked up to those people, Collymores and your Bohemians, as I say, and just being up there with these incredible football teams. And we then went to Europe. And although there wasn't a massive gap, obviously High Sullard really counted against us in the 80s, the ban. Because we would have gone back a couple of times at least, and Clough being Clough, we would have done something in one of those competitions. But we hadn't been around in the competition for about 10 years. So that was a great thing. Probably felt like it was ages, but in relative terms, modern game, we haven't been back now for 30 odd years. So that was brilliant and so well loved how we were the last team, we were the last British team left in European competition that season. And Frank Clark led us to the quarter-final against Bayern Munich, where we sadly succumbed. But they were famous heady days, and I know so many Forest fans who class them among their greatest memories of seeing that team get to third in the Premier League and get into the quarter-final of the UEFA Cup. But as you touched on, Rory, we just couldn't make it last. I said earlier on, we had that bit of a cycle sometimes where we would peak, and then we would just drift away, whether it be over a couple of years or a bit more instantaneous. And that's what happened with Forest. Dave said it a moment ago. We somehow got through that middling patch of the 90s by various circumstances and some very, very shrewd business. But in hindsight, there was a little bit of quicksand there and we were slowly sinking before we even knew it. You look back to that sort of February, March time, we crashed out of the quarter-final of the FA Cup to Villa. We lost in the quarter-final of the UEFA Cup to Bayern Munich, and the signs were there that we were never going to recover. We finished ninth, I think, and I think we were all thinking the season after could do something again, and we finished bottom. And we were out of our depth before we knew it, and obviously goes without saying the loss of people like Collymore and Bohemian was such we just couldn't replace them, and we could never afford to replace them either. So we sank, and we got back. We had a bit of a disastrous takeover, but it gave us enough impetus and enough injection to go and get the likes of Pierre van Hooijdonk and and he was brilliant for us. He was absolutely brilliant, and we shot back up. But again, it was a little bit mirrored in that we shot back up, but straight away again things were falling apart before the season had even kicked. Van Hooijdonk on strike, Kevin Campbell had been sold, Colin Cooper was sold just after the season started, and we were wallowing. I mean, we had such a disastrous season, and that was it really. Yeah, we had a couple of little flicks where we jumped back up, but we were on a downward spiral. If you take out those little isolated moments of promotion back up there and suddenly thinking we had a chance, probably from '96 we were on a downward trajectory, and we sadly for us we struggled to recover for a long time.
Just that '96 season, Matt, that when we went out of the FA Cup to Villa and Bayern Munich and slipped to ninth, I think we had, I was looking at this the other day, we had 8 games in April, in 29 days. And we just, obviously the fixture list caught with us, we just couldn't sustain it. But just going back to sort of your experiences of what it was like for that, because I'd started a bit earlier going in the 80s, I did think, oh, this is it. We are, always top half of the first division. We go to Wembley once every 2 years. This is brilliant. So when we went down, but we came back up in the mid-90s under Frank Clark, I just kind of felt that, okay, normal service resumed. This is, of course, that was a blip going down. This is where we are. Everything's fine. Little did I know that obviously since 1996, we would not have a good season in the Premier League until this current season.
A long old time when you think about it like that. Of course, you don't know what's ahead of you. And I remember when we eventually did succumb finally, in terms of we never actually made it back up straight away like we did in the 90s. You always think, oh, this will be our season. This will be our season. And I know we're not alone in thinking like that. But I remember a weird thing that pops into my head. I remember Oldham. If I'm not mistaken,
don't mention Oldham.
They started in the Premier League. You guys might correct me, but were Oldham there in the first
season?
They
were.
And I remember in about, I'm sort of estimating a little bit here, but I remember in about the year 2000, and I remember looking at Oldham and thinking, they've been out of the Premier League now for about 5 or 6 years, and I thought, God, I'd hate to be them. You can imagine like being a team that gets stuck out of the top flight for so long. And you didn't know. You always just felt with Forest, because we were a so-called top flight team, and obviously the Clough era always kind of established that for us. We always felt we'd get back up, even though looking back now, we were god awful for some of that. And we had our moments, of course we did. We had some brilliant times in relative sense, but we just got stuck. And it's just, you know what? You look back now, and it's a scary thing that happens to you. And I look at the Championship now, and you can almost, with a bit of hindsight, you can see it happening to other teams. You bounce around for a little bit, and then you think, oh, hang on, suddenly we've been here 5 years, and then it becomes 10 years. And of course, that's without even going into the whole chaos of going down to League One for 3 years, which probably, Rory, would be a year's worth of podcasts in itself.
We still all need some group therapy for that. But also, Matt, sort of like, just briefly on that again, let's dwell on that misery. What also really we probably found difficult to handle when we were in the Championship for God knows how long was that there were teams like Wigan, there were teams like Fulham who were in the bottom division as well, and they were just like well-run clubs who were overtaking us. Barnsley had a season in the Premier League after us as well. Watford, all of these teams, and you're kind of thinking that should be us, not because we're brilliant, because we're Forest and we did win the European Cup twice and all that kind of thing. But you just kind of get the sense that we just couldn't compete. We just didn't know what we were doing as a football club. And you saw traditionally smaller clubs, just well run and sort of having a bit of the Premier League pie. And you kind of glanced around and wondered, when is it our turn, and how did we get here? And how long do we have to stay here, because this is miserable?
It was an almighty hangover, wasn't it? That's what it feels like. You look back now, it was a hangover. We were this big club in the 80s, 90s, and we couldn't cope with it anymore. And I think club players in particular used to come in and not necessarily turn up for the right reasons. So yeah, I think that's probably a good way to describe it. We couldn't get out of bed for so long, for however many decades it was.
I mean, that's the thing, and that's what I was going to say, and this is where this is why I wanted to bring up perception, is because I was born in '96, so to me, Forest have always been sorry to say it, a championship club until obviously I started learning about the history of the team. Within my lifespan, they have always been a staple championship club. And what me and my friends' limited exposure to English football was outside of the televised games, the likes of your Boltons, Wigans, Blackburns, Reddens, these were Premier League clubs to us. And now, all of them at some point are still in or have spent time in League One. They've been mismanaged into the ground. You've got other clubs, obviously Bury, the big one as well, who ended up going bust. You've got so many different things that have happened since then, since that kind of mid-noughties Premier League era, that, you know, just as you're mentioning about other clubs there, it's a shame to see that all these other clubs had a slice of the pie, but a lot of them aren't really doing too well for themselves as well. Portsmouth, probably another one. Derby, obviously. I don't know if Southampton are still on to match them for the worst points total, if not beat them. But, you know, unfortunately, Forest were just another victim of that happening.
I think on that, Rory, there's a wider tale to be told about the state of football finances in general there.
I would completely agree with you.
Whole of a podcast, I think, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a whole other episode in itself in terms of the management of clubs. And, you know, we've covered it so many times before when we do episodes on lost football clubs, especially how these things can just end up happening. And it's, as we've mentioned a few times, it's all turned into a bit of a shit show. But I think this is why Forest in the modern day, and I'm talking specifically about the last 5 years, everyone has kind of backed them and bought into the underdog story and the underdog vibe that Forest bring, is because everyone's looking at this kind of era of modern football, you know, your Man Cities, your Pep Guardiolas, where everything's about statistics and how many passes you make in the system footballers, and then in come Forest, throwing a complete spanner in the works. And this season in particular, really, really upsetting a lot of these big name teams, and it's brilliant to see, and it's great to see people are actually backing them, because they're like, we're fed up of this like overproduced brand of football that's existed for so long, that we want to back this style that's a lot closer to what we would say is probably proper football.
I think it's interesting the perception that you've just mentioned there, Rory, about our style of football, and I can see how it's maybe there's a weird sort of strand which is not to everybody's cup of tea. It's non-possession. It's just hitting teams on the counter. Absolutely brilliant, all for that. But there is, I'm not sure I'm a big believer in football or football club DNA. Certainly, it's this mythical kind of thing. But if there is some kind of Nottingham Forest style, I'd argue that throughout Brian Clough's tenure, that was the way that we did it. It was always built on solid defence. It was always built on wingers and just attacking teams on the counter-attack. It was never sort of dominate possession football. It was always counter-attack football in the 80s under Brian Clough. And when we won the European Cup as well, that was the predominant style. So there is that, you know, that kind of romantic. I'm not sure this is not a conscious approach by Nuno. Obviously, it's a pragmatic approach to the players he's got. But Forest have down the years been associated with counter-attacking football.
No, I mean it's quite interesting that you say that about the football club's DNA, because whereas you might argue it's a mythical thing, I would probably argue otherwise, that it's something that isn't tangible, but it's something that is ultimately there. And I think that's one of the things that is, it's the identity, the way that a club plays, the things that a fan do, and the feeling around the club as well. But it's like you said, the club have always kind of played that style of football, and it works for them. And it's certainly working for them at the moment. But before we just kind of jump ahead onto the culture side of things, Matt, first of all, I wanted you to tell me, because this kind of plays into your book, what kind of things did Nottingham Forest actually pioneer? Obviously, your book's called Trailblazers. Tell us, what types of things did Nottingham Forest pioneer?
Well, touched on it earlier on. I think this is the part of our history which I've truly loved putting this together, in that although we might have had these spans where nothing really happened on paper, things were happening, and we were fairly remarkably, actually, for one single football club, we were behind a lot of different things. So the book, first of all, spans the entire history of Forest, all what is now 160 years. And I start with the very simple matter of what were the tools that we brought to the game. So I don't mind giving a few little bits away, because a lot of Forest fans do know some of these stories, and I've just helped flesh them out a little bit in the book. But in the 1870s, we were behind whistles and shin pads come into the game. And one particular guy, Sam Widdowson, who is quite key to the book, he was involved in both of those elements. And obviously, think about those now. I mean, they are key to football, aren't they now? And they have been all this time. But Forest were there at the very beginning in the 1870s, turning up at a game against Sheffield Norfolk and saying, how about this? We've bought one of these little whistles. And they weren't referees at the time. They were two umpires that the club provided, and going, well, when they try and stop play, they're waving a white handkerchief. And let's face it, it's not the best way to stop a game of football. How about he blows this whistle? And Sheffield and Norfolk, to their credit, went, yeah, sounds like a good idea. And it ran from there. Same with the shin pads. Both had their dissenters, I think it's clear to say. But that carried on. And without going into every last element, it carried on. Think of things that are key to the game today. And Forest have generally had a role in those physical, tangible items. And not just in the Victorian era, but in the years and gone where we were doing bits around, there's one particular bit in the 1950s when we were experimenting with an orange ball, which of course became more prevalent as the years went on. So we did those sort of physical things that you could hold in your hand, if that's the good way to put it. But what I loved about Forest reading this story, and it was new to me as well, a lot of this, was how we were defiant and how we were that underdog thing that's been a bit of a theme of this chat. We stood up against the bigger organisations, and we fought for what we believed right at times. We had fingerprints in how the transfer system evolved. Talked a little bit about the resistance to professional football, but that is a key part of the book as well, and I think a really fascinating one. We were doing our very best to be an established, brilliant football club. But I think we put it on an even footing, I really do, to actually be a club that was admired and respected for what it brought to the game. We tried to find ways to play the game better. And there are, I should say, and I do stress this in the book, Forest are not always the only club that have done X, Y and Z. They were trying to find ways of passing while there were teams like Queen's Park up in Scotland doing very similar things, Royal Engineers, who were a military-based team. And I talk about all those other clubs. Sheffield FC, I mean, obviously, are well known for for what they gave to the sport in the very earliest of days. But I try and give credit where it's due, but I just keep coming back to think, well, look what Forest have done, and we nudge this forward, but we also nudge this forward and this forward. And we were involved in, as I mentioned, key developments in the setup of the league. We did extraordinary things in the earliest days of the FA Cup. And one of the things that I really got me onto this story, actually, was a 1905 trip to South America, where we weren't the first English club there. Forest had been invited the year before, but decided against it. So Southampton went, but Southampton were a Southern League club at the time. And then the year after, they were clearly desperate to get us there. I think there was some Nottingham expats based in Buenos Aires, and they got us out there. We went on a vessel, if that's the right word, across the Atlantic for 3 weeks. Took a team of about 15 of us, including a trainer. And we helped, and I've had an Argentinian historian involved in this with me to help tell this particular story. And we helped develop the South American game in Argentina and Uruguay, and we did phenomenal things. And I think the thing I kept coming back to, Rory, was when you then add it to some of the groundbreaking stuff that happened in the 50s that we've talked about, and then in the 70s under Clough and Taylor, as well as quite a lot in the more modern history, 90s, and even up to the present day. It's remarkable to me how Forest are the one team that we keep coming back to time and time again. And sometimes, quite unwittingly, I will add, and I stress that, we aren't a club that have always gone out looking for pioneering traditions. Sometimes we've just found ourselves in that position. We were one of the two top flight teams to be first on television in 1983 when we played at Spurs. We were there at the advent of that. We just have this tendency sometimes just to be there at the right place, but undoubtedly we're also a club that have tried to thrust ourselves forward and actually try and cajole the game and inspire. And the book, across 20 chapters, across various different themes and various different decades, I hope tells the story of a really fascinating football club that have done so much for the game that probably a lot of it goes unnoticed.
Just that Tottenham game, Matt, sorry, we were winning 1-0 and we lost 2-1, a last-minute winner for Tottenham. I cried.
I'm sure we've all, well, I've certainly been there. I'm sure many other listeners have been there as well. We've all been there. But I think that's quite important what you said though, Matt, is that, you know, even just by trying to progress yourselves, you ultimately progress the game. Progress breeds progress. Yeah. And by doing that, Forest have kind of written this into their identity. But it's like you said, a lot of these things aren't well known. And that's quite important as well. You know, why isn't it well known? Why aren't people talking about this more? So it's actually important that you've put this into a book, because it then means that you're carrying it into the the fan displays, you're telling more and more people about it, and it's actually giving it a new kind of lease of life by remembering it in this new way, because ultimately people might have actually just forgotten the story altogether, and that's the risk that we run with a lot of club histories, is that it just falls out of history altogether.
Yeah, very much so. And I think there's sort of two trains of thought with Forest in the last sort of 10 years or so. We went through a spell when we were really abject, sort of that sort of 7 or 8 years ago, before the new era of the new ownership, when things started to pick up a little bit. We almost got a bit fed up with our history. And by that, I specifically mean there was a fair contingent who were getting fed up with us, sort of so-called living in the past that, of course, we're accused of in terms of 79 and 80 in the European Cups. But I always felt, as the second part of that, I always felt that we were getting it wrong a little bit, in that we were clearly remembering that fantastic time. Of course, that was the peak of our history and probably will always remain it in many ways. But I've always had this thing about there is a deeper history to Forest beyond Brian Clough. And with the greatest respect to him, it was there doing fantastic things before him, and it was certainly doing fantastic things after him as well, even though it doesn't always seem like it. So I think one of my personal passion parts of this project I've been on with this book was that I wanted to actually make people sit up and take notice that, look at this story, and look at what we did here, and tell a story that, okay, 79 and 80 are very much part of that story, because they have to be. But I'm more trying to tell that alternative glance at it, where I think, well, look at what we did here. And there are, and what I'd say to Forest fans in particular, but also to any football fans, is there are some fascinating characters in the deep past of history. And because these people were never seen by any of us alive today, and because they've been long dead, sadly, you don't remember them, of course. It's just nature. That's just how it happens. It's sad. But I wanted to try and shine a bit of a light on some of these people at Forest and kind of go, how remarkable is it that this same man was behind the shin pad and the whistle, and was involved in doing things with other key developments of the game, like how we set the game up as a formation. And that all came from one man's brain, Sam Widdowson, who I mentioned earlier on. Then we go into sort of different eras, and it is an undercurrent, and I think I call it that in the book. You don't notice it. It's not as distinct as sort of silver and gold and the trophies you're lifting at Wembley, but it's a really rich history, and I think these stories should be heard. And I think Forest fans, certainly from the feedback I've had so far, Forest fans are enjoying hearing that little bit about that different history. That I actually think, I've always been quite proud of my club and what they've achieved, but there is a whole wealth of stuff here that is far deeper and far more richer than people ever understood. And when you combine that with Clough and Taylor, and you combine that with what the likes of Steve Cooper and Nuno have done in recent years, you're back thinking, you know what, this is a fantastic, important football club.
Matt, if I could just I've been watching an interview with Steve Stone from the 90s recently, a great player for us in the 90s, and I stumbled across this quote that he said about history, about football, about the importance of Nottingham Forest as well. So I'm just going to read what he said. He said this: Forest fans need to know that the club that they support is unique, and that's no bullshit. I've played for other football clubs, and they are not unique. You see people walking across Trent Bridge, and the minute you get into that stadium, you have a feeling of, this is a good club. And when you walk in as a player, you have a feeling of, this is a proper football club, surrounded by history. And that's the best you can say about any football club. And I thought Stone kind of nailed it there. You know, it's like Cooper said, this place oozes football. Now, obviously, each club has got its own history. Of course it has, and great stories to tell. But it just kind of, Stone just captured that sort of aura of what happened at that football club. Yeah, winning European Cups, Brian Clough walked out of that tunnel, and you've got a direct link to the past. And I think that's just really important at a time when lots of football clubs are changing identity, rebranding, moving stadiums, moving grounds. We all need to sort of hold on to something, to that warm comfort blanket of nostalgia. And like I said, in a place where the tectonics are shifting and football clubs are not quite franchises, but we might not be too many decades off that. It's really important just to try to link it back to the 1800s. And I think we're lucky. We're really lucky in the sense that Forest have been at this place for so long, and the place just drips with history.
Well, it's like you've said there, Dave, what heritage ultimately is being able to walk into a place and recognise either tangibly or intangibly the link to the past. Do you know what I mean? It's the things from the past that impact and inform the present and ultimately the future. And if you can go to a football club and immediately feel what that club is about, again, it's an intangible, but feeling is a big part of that intangibility. It's the people that create that feeling. It's the things within the fabric of the club that create that feeling. And I'm so glad that you mentioned branding, because to move on to the last bit of the episode to talk a little bit about the fan culture and the fan identity, which you both are heavily involved in. First of all, and in my opinion, it's way ahead of its time, because it's, and this isn't a slight on it by any means, it's the type of badge that would be designed by some SME marketing agency in London somewhere. The badge is so iconic, and it's incredible that you've had it from the 70s. Is that right? 70s, 75, I think, actually, is the date of it.
Yeah, 73.
73. It's incredible because, again, it's the type of thing that you would see a modern club rebrand to, but Forest haven't had to, because they've had this badge since then. And it's all, it's the perfect badge. I absolutely love it. It's incredible in terms of a club identity and brand sense. And it's really helped the club in the modern era, because it means that they don't need to change that.
Yeah.
It's ideal because you can draw it on your pencil case at school.
And you can draw it. And I remember we were lucky. We were lucky enough, and certainly one of my favourite things I've ever done around Forest, no matter what my age and no matter what year. In 2023, I reached out to David Lewis, who was the competition winner who designed the badge, and we did a very specific fan display in a game against Manchester United in that year. And I met David and I interviewed him, and he showed me some of the early prototypes. And I remember him saying that, Dave, about that simplistic on the pencil case. He said, that's what I wanted to do. He said they were talking about going over the top and having various trees in there and doing all these things. And he said, I just wanted to make something that was simplistic, that a kid could draw it. And because he was a graphic designer and fairly famously now, I think the story's quite well known at Forest, but perhaps not any wider, is that he entered under a pseudonym because his boss at the time at Nottingham, I think it was the Polytechnic, which is now Trent University, his boss was on the judging panel and he didn't want to be favoured. So David went in under his mother's maiden name and put the badge forward, and it won. But he went through a process where then he obviously had to. His boss found out, having selected the winner, that it was his employee that had the chosen design. So it was a fascinating story, and you're right. It stands the test of time, not because it's anything too deep or cluttered. It's just a straightforward, simple badge, and it represents what we are. And just quickly, I think it's come to the fore again since 2023, in that there's been a lot of talk about Forest potentially moving away from the City Ground. But one of the key arguments for retaining that place on the river, not just that fantastic view and that brilliant, iconic image that everyone sees going across Trent Bridge, but actually, when you think about the badge, it is us. It has the River Trent running past it, and it is part of who we are. We've talked a little bit about identity and DNA. And that badge is probably as close to defining who Forest are, because it's not just a tree or a rounded badge designed by a marketing agency, as you say. It was designed by someone who, although not particularly a Forest fan at the time, just put some thought into what Forest are and what Forest represent. And the tree by the river is very simply what Forest stand for. And that will always define us, and so will the City Ground, because of that iconic location.
Yeah, I mean, I think with him not being a Forest fan, but him knowing and being able to understand what the club stands for, I think that speaks about Nottingham Forest as a club and the way that they show themselves off. And yeah, just finally, as I said, with you both being involved in fanzines and Matt organising fan displays, if you just want to tell our listeners, both of you, what Forest culture and identity is and what it means to you. I mean, this could be an entire podcast in itself, but I don't want to finish up this episode without having a good crack at it at the very least.
That's a big question. I guess it comes down to, and you're asking us a really good time, but rarely it's something you take pride in. Even when we were rubbish and in League One, you kind of like, yeah, I'm a Forest fan. Yeah, but you're rubbish. Yeah, I know we're rubbish, but we're Forest and we did this and we were really good at one stage, and we'll probably never do that again. But do you know what? That kind of makes it all the more special. And obviously in recent years, in the last 4 or 5 years, there's a real sense of sort of I don't know, pride in sticking by this deeply mediocre club for 23 years. And it's just like anything, really. Things move in circles, the wheel turns, and it goes beyond that as well, obviously. It's not just... Because if we all were football fans who just wanted to revolve... Our life revolved around results, then we'd have all given up a long time ago, basically. So what it is, it's the whole... Football in many ways is incidental. It's the whole ritual which we've all got of going to the games, going to the city ground, meeting various people, going to the same places before, going to the places after, talking about it. And it's a bit of a cliche, really, but Nottingham Forest has become a part of my life that I never imagined it would be. I knew I'd always be a fan, but it's become sort of all-encompassing, and it's become sort of part of my social identity as well, in terms of friendship and family and all those kind of things. It's ridiculous how much it forms of our lives. It's almost embarrassing, really.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, and that part about the friendship circles, Dave, that you talked about, that I think we're not just talking as Forest fans here, that's applying to probably football fans all over the world. But it is important, and I think there is a comradeship that you get on the terraces and in the stands with people who you don't even know them personally, but they're just people that you nod to at, whether it's Stockport or whether it's the Emirates or wherever it is, and these people you have some sort of kinship with over the years, and without ever getting to know them too deeply, you are just people that share a passion. And I think with football fans, certainly those of us that are fortunate enough to go and see our team home and away, there is a bit of a bond there. And I think one of the things I like is you go to... I remember, although we lost at Arsenal just towards the end of the year, just chatting to an Arsenal fan on the tube back to the car and stuff like that, and you just finding out about other clubs, and you are part of that strange old circle that we're all in. There's thousands of us in it, of course. It's hardly a small group, but it's something deeply fascinating. And what gets me is you talk to people at work or you talk to people in your family who aren't part of that process. Of getting up on a Saturday morning and going to a game or jumping on a train, and they often struggle with the concept of it. And I think wherever we are and whoever we're supporting, there is something deeply rewarding about going, and especially I think when you've been pretty poor for a number of years, like we've known in recent decades, and then you have that revival and you have that resurrection, and you look around the leagues, there are various clubs going through it at the moment, certainly not just Forest, but we are clinging on to something so exciting at the moment. So when I couple that with going with my mates who I've met on terraces and in League One and in the Championship and in the depths of our despair at times, I think it's really, really fantastic and just rewarding that you go to places, and now actually having stood together shoulder to shoulder on places where we've had terrible days. Yeovil getting knocked out in the playoffs in 2007 springs to mind. Suddenly, you're winning at Old Trafford and you're winning at Anfield, and now there's talk about Forest going back to the Champions League. And that particular thing, to bring it into the modern day, is what I really love about football. And yes, I love the history side of it. I love looking back, and I love how unique Forest are. But that is all just part of that joy of going to see them play. And I think as football fans, that is what it always boils down to. Going to see your team play, win, draw or lose, and you are having fantastic days.
It's so weird how you can bond so strongly with people simply because you've got a shared history. You know, there, as Matt said, there are people you'd see at Forest games. You don't really know who their names are, but you shared this history. So that means, even though they might be of a totally different walk of life and have utterly different views on life to you, for that moment or for that 90 minutes, you just mentioned Yeovil, and to Forest fans, just watch the despair come across their eyes, and that is part of being a Forest fan, and that's not just a Forest fan, but it's that shared history, isn't it? You just need to. Every club's got its own trigger words for joy or despair as well, and that's such a strange thing, yet beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for us, and I would have missed most of it, it's Celtic in the 90s is one that gets thrown around an awful lot because the club nearly ceased to exist, and they were terrible before and for a period after that as well. But it's interesting how you've mentioned these shared things. And I've always found it quite interesting, the one that you mentioned, that of like being at work with people who aren't followers of football and they don't really understand it. And it's quite, I know this sounds terrible, but I find it quite difficult to speak to them because I'm like, well, what else are you doing on Saturday? But it's like, you're going to be hard. I've said this so many times on this show. You're going to be hard pressed to find anything else where you walk along the same streets to go to the same places, go to the same restaurants, the same pubs for at least 2 hours a week, every other week. It's incredibly ritualistic in nature, and it's something that doesn't get spoken about enough, that this is just such a cultural phenomenon that football fans engage with once or a couple of times every month. It's magnificent. Just one final question for you, Matt. What's your plans for Forza Garibaldi?
Well, I certainly can't tell you what the next one is, because that would just be wrong of me to go and reveal the surprise. But there are certainly plans. I think we've risen from a point of being a really low ebb as a club, and it's good that our group has sort of risen with the club, really, and been there from that bit of a renaissance. So what we want to try and do, we've got a really exciting final 3-4 months of the season, because these are unprecedented times for Forest in a modern setting. Of course, there's a whole generation, maybe two, that have not seen Forest do anything close to what we are doing right now, sat third in the Premier League. So as a group, I think we need to do our best to hang on to the coattails of an amazing set of players and actually do what we can to support them in the stands, which I look back with a bit of pride. We were doing that back in 2016, 2017, when we were struggling to stay in the Championship, staying up on goal difference on the last day of our first full season. But we were there as a group and as an entire fan base backing them then. And we've moved on to do that now when we are fighting for European football. And with everything we've talked about, with our heritage of winning things and European football, these are exciting times, because we've heard about these stories of the past, and we want to see them again with our own eyes. So as a group, Forza Garibaldi will be trying to be as energetic and as visible in the coming months as we possibly can. We're always obviously relying on fan donations. It's all fully fan funded, and that's always been important to us. But we will be trying to do various things to try and raise money. The book, by the way, is one of those avenues. That all my own personal cut will be going into banners and things like that in the coming months. So that will be important to us as a group to come together, make sure that the Trent End, where we usually do most of our activity, is coming alive again with big banners and flags. And the sole purpose of trying to drive on our football team back to as high a place in the Premier League as we possibly can muster.
And as high a place in Europe as you can possibly muster as well. As I said,
that too.
It's looking...
Oh, we're not going there to make up the numbers, Rory. We're going there to win it again.
Exactly, absolutely. And I don't want to speak too early now, but I think it's pretty unlikely that you won't at this point in time. And I think the fact that quite a lot of people are actually back in Forest is... again, it's testament to what is a phenomenal club, a really unique club, and a really interesting club when we're talking about identity and culture. I'd probably say that a club, maybe not so much flies under the radar, because everyone remembers Forest and what they've done in terms of Europe, but in terms of how the club is and the fabric of the club, and again, coming back to the club's identity, really does fly under the radar. A lot of people maybe aren't aware that this isn't just your average English football club. This is a club that actually stands for something, believes in something, and has the history and the people behind it to actually reinforce that as well, which is something you can never really take for granted. Is there anything else that you guys want to add just before we finish up for tonight?
No, just to say thanks for having us on. I've really enjoyed that. It's good to spend a bit of time talking about the deeper history beyond Clough and Taylor in particular. So yeah, really enjoyed that, and hopefully you have as well.
I'd echo that. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to us just witter on.
Ramble on.
Forest, we could do this for this is what we do most weeks anyway, so we could do it for over 2 hours.
Yeah, no, this has been great. As I've said in a couple of episodes now, the purpose of me being on these episodes is to bring the heritage elements to it, as well as the little bits of football knowledge that I know about whatever topic we're talking about that day. And outside of that, it's just me listening to people tell the stories about their clubs, which is a great mix, because it means that I can sit and listen to great stories. I can learn some more, and just bring the expertise that I have and try and kind of pull out some more about our football clubs that we might not be able to explain or describe, and that's ultimately what I love doing about, and what I ultimately love doing within heritage as well, is just kind of explaining to people, like, this is why your club does this, and this is why this stand's called that, and all that kind of stuff. But we can cover that in an episode another day. Dave, Matt, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This has been a fantastic episode, and I really hope our listeners have enjoyed it as well. If there's anything that you want us to cover, anything that you want to ask us about tonight's episode, then please do get in touch. Best way to do it is to DM us on X or BlueSky. That's @_footyheritage. Or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. But for now, Matt, say goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Dave, say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.